The cold Manhattan winter bled through the thin, rattling window panes of the Brooklyn apartment, carrying with it the scent of exhaust and damp concrete. Inside, the radiator hissed a rhythmic, dying breath, barely putting up a fight against the chill that had settled into the corners of the room. Lorena sat on the floor, her knees pressed against the cracked linoleum that she had spent the last hour scrubbing. The harsh, biting scent of ammonia stung her nostrils, a sharp contrast to the delicate notes of sandalwood and white lilies that used to define her world. She looked down at her hands. They were the hands of a stranger. Once, these fingers had moved with the fluid grace of a prima ballerina's leaps across the ivory keys of a Steinway, or gripped a fine sable brush to capture the sunrise over the Amalfi Coast. They were hands meant for fine arts, for turning pages of first-edition poetry, and for being kissed by men who understood the value of the soul behind them. Now, the skin was raw and reddened, the cuticles frayed from excessive contact with boiling water and cheap dish soap. Small, stinging cracks had formed around her knuckles, angry red reminders of the 3 years she had spent playing the role of the small-town waitress who had nothing but her heart to offer. Every morning, Lorena woke up before the sun to pack a humble lunch for Ronald, carefully calculating the pennies she could save by skipping her own breakfast or walking 20 blocks instead of taking the subway. She did it out of a love that was both beautiful and terrifyingly naive. It was a silent sacrifice, a self-imposed exile from a world of gilded cages and empty smiles. Why am I doing this? The question often echoed in the hollow silence of the apartment when Ronald was away. Her internal monologue was a complex tapestry of hope and fear. She had grown up surrounded by billions, where every "I love you" felt like a transaction and every friendship had a hidden invoice. Her father, a titan of industry whose name graced skyscrapers and charity galas, had always warned her, "Lorena, people like us don't find love, we find alliances." She had spent 22 years rebelling against that cynicism. She wanted to know, needed to know, if there was a version of Lorena who was worth loving without the inheritance, without the social standing, and without the power. So, she had built the silver cage of thrift store sweaters. The one she wore now was a muted, itchy gray wool, pilled at the elbows and smelling vaguely of someone else's memories. It was her armor. To Ronald, she was the girl who had moved to the city with a single suitcase and a dream of a simple life. To Ronald, she was someone he had saved from the insignificance of a rural upbringing. She had allowed him that narrative because she wanted to see if his love was strong enough to carry the weight of her perceived poverty. But lately, the weight was becoming unbearable. Not the physical labor. Lorena could handle the scrubbing and the saving, but the weight of the silence that was growing between them. The front door groaned on its hinges, and the heavy thud of Ronald's work boots broke her reverie. Lorena quickly stood up, wiping her damp hands on her apron, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're home early," she said, her voice soft, carrying a hint of the exhaustion she usually tried to hide. Ronald didn't look at her. He tossed his keys onto the laminate counter, the metallic ring echoing like a gunshot in the small space. He looked weary, but it was a different kind of weariness. It was the look of a man who was tired of the life he was living, not the work he was doing. His eyes swept over the cramped kitchen, landing briefly on Lorena's reddened hands before flitting away with a shadow of something that looked dangerously like disgust. "The heater is barely working again, Lorena," he muttered, his voice cold. "I'm working 16-hour days to get the startup off the ground, and I come home to a refrigerator that's practically empty and a wife who looks like she's given up." Lorena felt a sharp pang in her chest, a physical ache that moved from her heart to her throat. "I look like I've given up." She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him that the refrigerator was empty because she had used the last of the grocery money to pay for his new professional headshots. She wanted to show him the spreadsheet in her mind where she tracked every cent saved so he could chase his dream. Instead, she walked over to him, reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm sorry, Ronald. I'll make something work. I'll go to the market tonight. I just wanted to make sure the house was clean for you." He pulled his arm away, a subtle but devastating movement. "Cleanliness doesn't pay the bills, Lorena. My mother is right. Ambition needs a partner, not a maid." He walked past her into the bedroom, leaving the scent of his frustration, and a faint, unfamiliar trail of expensive floral perfume lingering in the air. Lorena stood alone in the kitchen, the gray wool of her thrift store sweater suddenly feeling like a leaden shroud. She looked back at the linoleum floor, now sparkling and clean, reflecting the flickering light of the single bulb above. She had scrubbed away the dirt, but she couldn't scrub away the realization that was starting to take root in her mind. Ronald didn't love the woman who sacrificed everything for him. He loved the idea of a woman who could give him more. She walked to the window and looked out at the New York skyline. In the distance, the lights of Midtown Manhattan glittered like a taunting promise. Somewhere out there, among the towers of glass and steel, was a building that bore her family's crest. Somewhere out there, she was a queen. But here, in the dim light of a Brooklyn evening, she was just a woman in a cheap sweater, realizing that the man she had chosen to love was failing the only test that truly mattered. The weight of the silent sacrifice finally began to feel less like a choice and more like a tragedy. Lorena gripped the edge of the sink, her raw knuckles turning white. She wasn't ready to break the cage yet, but for the first time in 3 years, she found herself wondering if the bird inside was still alive, or if she had accidentally smothered it in her quest for a love that didn't exist. The Manhattan wind howled louder outside, a morning cry for a promise that was slowly being unraveled by the very hands that had tried so hard to hold it together. The morning sun did not shine into the Brooklyn apartment. It merely bruised the sky with a dull, leaden gray that seeped through the grime on the windows. Lorena stood by the small, chipped laminate counter, her movements mechanical as she brewed the morning coffee. It was a cheap, store-brand roast, the kind that left an oily film on the surface and a sharp, metallic aftertaste on the tongue. She had learned to drink it black, a penance of sorts for the life she was pretending to lead. She poured a cup for Ronald, the steam rising in a weak, tepid plume. As she set it down, the sound of a key turning sharply in the lock shattered the heavy silence. Lorena's shoulders tensed instinctively. There was only one other person with a key, and she never arrived with a knock. Deborah swept into the room like a cold front off the Atlantic, the scent of stale cigarettes and a pungent, knock-off designer perfume preceding her. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she draped her faux fur coat over the back of the sofa Lorena had spent all of yesterday vacuuming, her eyes immediately darting around the room with the predatory precision of a hawk looking for a crack in the glass. "It's freezing in here, Ronald," Deborah announced, her voice a shrill rasp that grated against the morning quiet. She didn't look at Lorena. She never did, at least not at first. To Deborah, Lorena was a piece of the furniture, and an out-of-fashion piece at that. "The radiator is acting up again, Mom," Ronald muttered from the table, his eyes glued to his laptop screen. He didn't look up to greet his mother, but his posture shifted, his spine curving as if under a weight. Lorena placed a plate of toast and soft-boiled eggs on the table. It was a modest meal, precisely calculated to cost less than $3 for the three of them. "Good morning, Deborah," she said, her voice a practiced exercise in forced neutrality. "Would you like some coffee?" Deborah finally turned her gaze toward Lorena, her eyes traveling slowly from the frayed hem of Lorena's oversized sweater to the raw, red skin of her knuckles. She let out a short, sharp huff of derision. "If that's what you call that swamp water in the pot, no thank you. I'll wait until I can get a real cup from a place that doesn't smell like lemon bleach and despair." She sat down at the table, pushing the plate of eggs away as if it were contaminated. "Ronald, I saw the bills on the counter. The startup is bleeding, and you're still living like a commoner. I told you, son, a man is only as successful as the woman on his arm. And right now, your arm is draped in thrift store wool." Lorena felt the first needle prick her skin. It was a familiar sensation, the slow, methodical application of psychological warfare that Deborah had mastered over the last 3 years. "Lorena is doing her best, Mom," Ronald said, but the words lacked conviction. They were the words of a man reciting a script he no longer believed in. He finally looked at Lorena, and for a fleeting second, his gaze was soft with pity, but as the silence stretched, the pity curdled into something sharper, resentment. "Her best." Deborah laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Ronald, she's a waitress from a town no one can find on a map. She has the soul of a peasant, and she's dragging you down into the mud with her." Look at her hands, for heaven's sake. She looks like she belongs in a scullery, not a boardroom. How are you supposed to pitch to investors when your wife looks like she hasn't seen a manicure or a silk dress since the turn of the century? The word peasant hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Inside the silver cage of her own making, Lorena's true self stirred. A flash of memory sparked in her mind. Her 21st birthday gala at the Met, the weight of $1 million diamond necklace against her throat, the way the most powerful men in the world had lowered their voices when she spoke. She knew the feel of hand-loomed silk and the taste of vintage champagne that cost more than this entire building. She wasn't a peasant. She was a sovereign in exile. But here, she was Lorena, the girl with the red knuckles and the bitter coffee. I save where I can so Ronald can put every cent into the business, Lorena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. I don't mind the work. That's the problem, dear, Deborah snapped, leaning forward. You don't mind it. You're comfortable in the dirt. You don't have a hunger for the finer things because you don't know what they are. You're a placeholder, Lorena. A temporary comfort for a man who was lost. But Ronald isn't lost anymore. He's found his ambition, and it's a shame he has to come home to this. Deborah gestured vaguely at Lorena, but the insult was total. Lorena looked at Ronald, waiting for the defense that never came. He was staring at her now, his eyes tracing the lines of exhaustion on her face. In that look, she saw the slow erosion of her self-worth reflected back at her. He wasn't seeing her sacrifice. He was seeing her lack. He was seeing the woman his mother described, a girl who was less than, a girl who was not enough. Maybe Mom has a point, Ken, Ronald said softly, the nickname feeling like a betrayal. I mean, look at us. We're always counting pennies. Don't you ever want more? Or is this really all you dreamed of? The bitterness of the coffee finally reached Lorena's throat, thick and choking. I chose this for you, she wanted to scream. I have more wealth in my name than you could dream of in 10 lifetimes, and I walked away from it to see if you would love me for my heart alone. But the heart she was offering was being picked apart, one needle-thin insult at a time. I dreamed of a home where we supported each other, Lorena whispered. A home needs a foundation of gold, not just support, Deborah sneered, standing up to reclaim her coat. I'm meeting a friend at the Grand Azure for brunch. You know, the kind of place where the napkins cost more than your rent. You should come see it sometime, Lorena, though I doubt they'd let you pass the service entrance in that sweater. Deborah walked toward the door, stopping only to press a kiss to Ronald's forehead. Think about what I said, son. The real estate market is booming, and the heiresses are looking for brilliant men. Don't let a small-town girl keep you in a small-time life. The door clicked shut, leaving a vacuum of silence in its wake. Ronald returned to his laptop, the clicking of the keys a barrier between them. Lorena picked up the cold, untouched eggs and walked to the sink. As she poured the bitter, cold coffee down the drain, she felt a piece of herself wash away with it. The erosion was subtle, but it was constant. Every day, a little more of the woman who knew her own power was being buried under the weight of their disdain. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, a gray-clad ghost in a gray-clad room. She wasn't ready to leave yet. She still held on to the fading hope that Ronald would wake up and see the queen behind the peasant. But as she began to scrub the breakfast plates, her raw knuckles stinging in the soapy water, Lorena realized that the cage wasn't just made of thrift store sweaters anymore. It was made of the silence of the man she loved, and that was a cage no amount of scrubbing could ever make clean. The bitterness of the morning lingered on her tongue, a cold reminder that while she was waiting for him to prove his love, he was busy calculating her worth and finding her wanting. The neon sign of the bodega across the street flickered, casting rhythmic pulses of sickly green light across the Brooklyn apartment ceiling. Lorena sat in the dark, the silence of the room, so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She hadn't turned on the lights. She didn't want to see the cracks in the walls or the worn patches on the rug. In the dark, she could almost pretend she was back in her father's library, surrounded by the comforting smell of old leather and mahogany, instead of the stale scent of a dying radiator and the lingering ghost of Deborah's insults. It was nearly 1 a.m. Her intuition, a sharp, cold blade she had tried to dull for 3 years, was currently carving a hollow space in her stomach. A wife's intuition is rarely a guess. It is a symphony of small, discordant notes that finally form a melody of betrayal. The sound of a key fumbled in the lock. Lorena didn't move. She watched as the door swung open, silhouetting Ronald against the dim hallway light. He didn't notice her at first. He moved with a strange, buoyant energy, a sharp contrast to the slumped shoulders and heavy sighs he usually brought home. "Ronald," she said quietly. He jumped, his hand flying to his chest. "Jesus, Lorena. Why are you sitting in the dark like a ghost?" "I was waiting for you," she replied, standing up. As she approached him, the air changed. The scent of the Brooklyn night, damp and metallic, was suddenly overruled by something else. It was the scent of jasmine. Not the synthetic, cloying jasmine of a drugstore candle, but the deep, intoxicating, and prohibitively expensive aroma of a vintage French perfume. It was a scent that belonged on Madison Avenue, in the back of a chauffeured town car, or draped over the shoulders of a woman who had never known the bite of ammonia. Lorena froze. The scent was a physical blow. "You're late. Was the networking event that long?" Ronald avoided her eyes, tossing his wool coat, the one Lorena had spent hours deep-pilling by hand onto the counter. "Yeah. Investors. You know how it is. If you're not the last one at the bar, you're not the one getting the check." He brushed past her, and the jasmine followed him like a taunting shadow. "I'm exhausted, Lorena. Let's just go to sleep." He headed for the bathroom, the sound of the shower soon drowning out the city noise. Lorena stood by the counter, her eyes fixed on his coat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She told herself to stop. She told herself that she was being the jealous, small-town girl Deborah accused her of being. But her hands moved of their own accord. She reached into the pocket of the coat. Her fingers brushed against a small, stiff slip of paper. She pulled it out. It wasn't a business card. It was a receipt from Vanderbilt and Company, one of the most exclusive jewelers in the Diamond District. Her eyes scanned the thermal print, her vision blurring. Item: platinum winged brooch with Marquise diamonds. Total: $14,500. The paper felt like it was burning her skin. $14,000. It was more than their rent for the entire year. It was more than the emergency fund she had painstakingly built by skipping meals and sewing her own clothes. And it certainly wasn't for her. Next Tuesday was her 25th birthday, the day she was supposed to reveal her true identity to him, but Ronald had never bought her anything more than a $10 bouquet of grocery store carnations. Lorena leaned against the sink, the cold porcelain the only thing keeping her upright. The sacrifice she had made, the Daista-like sweaters, the raw knuckles, the hidden billions, felt like a joke with a cruel punchline. She was playing a game of poverty to find a man of honor, while the man she chose was using her sacrifice to fund his entry into the very world she had fled. Inside the bathroom, under the scalding spray of the shower, Ronald pressed his forehead against the damp tiles. He was shaking. His mind was a battlefield where guilt and greed were engaged in a violent, messy war. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lorena's face, the way she looked when she handed him his packed lunch, her eyes full of a quiet, steady belief in him that he knew he didn't deserve. He remembered the girl he had met in that small town, the one who seemed like a breath of fresh air in a world of artifice. He had loved her. He was sure of it. But then he would hear his mother's voice, a constant, grating violin in the back of his head. Ambition needs a partner, not a maid. Tonight, at the gala Deborah had practically forced him to attend, he had met Siska. She was everything Lorena pretended not to be. Siska didn't smell like dish soap. She smelled like jasmine and power. When she looked at him, she didn't see a struggling founder. She saw a man who could be a titan, provided he had the right connections, her connections. The brooch was a thank you for a lead she had given him, or so he told himself. But he knew it was a down payment on a different life. With Siska, he felt like the version of himself he saw in his dreams, wealthy, respected, unburdened. With Lorena, he felt like a failure. Every time he saw her red knuckles, he was reminded of everything he couldn't provide. It was easier to resent her for her poverty than to hate himself for his inadequacy. It's for the business, he told himself, the lie tasting like ash. Lorena wouldn't understand. She's content in the dirt. She doesn't have the vision. He stepped out of the shower and dried himself, studiously avoiding his reflection in the cracked mirror. He couldn't look at the man who was currently calculating the cost of a soul. When Ronald emerged from the bathroom, the apartment was still dark. Lorena was standing by the window, her back to him. "You still up?" he asked, his voice forced and casual. "I found the receipt, Ronald," she said, her voice a low, vibrating chord of pain. The silence that followed was deafening. Ronald felt the blood drain from his face. "Lorena, I can explain. It's for a client, a high-net-worth individual. It's an investment in the company's future." Lorena turned around. In the green glow of the neon sign, she looked like a statue carved from grief. $14,000, Ronald. We can't afford the heat, but you can afford a diamond brooch for a client? You don't understand how this world works, he snapped, his guilt boiling over into a defensive rage. You are happy living like this, counting pennies and wearing rags. I'm not. I want a life that matters. I want to walk into a room and have people know my name. I thought I mattered, Lorena whispered. You do, but you're limited, Ken. You don't have the hunger. My mother is right. You're a girl who's comfortable in a small life. I'm trying to build an empire, and sometimes an empire requires sacrifices you can't comprehend. Lorena looked at the man she had lived for, and for the first time, she saw the hollow space where his integrity used to be. He was calling her limited, while she held the keys to the very empire he was willing to sell her for. The irony was a jagged glass in her throat. You're right, Lorena said, her voice suddenly, terrifyingly calm. I don't comprehend your sacrifices, Ronald, because I would never sacrifice a person for a piece of jewelry. She walked past him to the small sofa, lying down and pulling the itchy, gray wool blanket over her. Ronald stood in the middle of the kitchen, the jasmine perfume still clinging to his skin, feeling not like a future titan, but like a small, frightened man standing in the ruins of a trust he had just set on fire. Lorena closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She listened to the city hum outside, the sound of New York moving on without a care for the heart breaking in apartment 4B. Her intuition was no longer a blade, it was a map. And for the first time in 3 years, the map showed a path that led far, far away from Brooklyn. The scent of jasmine lingered in the room, a fragrant poison, as Lorena realized that the man she had loved was no longer the man she was living with. She had been waiting for him to pass the test, but tonight, Ronald hadn't just failed, he had cheated. The winter air in Brooklyn had a way of seeping through the brickwork, turning the apartment into a damp, airless box. But for Lorena, the cold was a distant memory, replaced by a searing, internal furnace that made the very air she breathed feel like molten lead. She lay on the bed, her body tangled in the thin, gray wool blanket that had become her only companion in the silence of the afternoon. Her skin was a map of contradictions, burning to the touch, yet riddled with violent shivers that made her bones ache as if they were being crushed by invisible hands. The flu had hit her like a physical blow 3 days ago, but the illness of the body was nothing compared to the sickness of the heart that had been festering since she found the receipt from Vanderbilt and Company. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Marquise diamonds on that winged brooch, a $14,000 betrayal pinned to the lapel of another woman's life. A sharp, rhythmic banging on the bedroom door shattered her fragile peace. Lorena, I know you can hear me. Stop playing the martyr and get out here. Deborah's voice sliced through the haze of Lorena's fever, shrill and devoid of mercy. Lorena struggled to sit up, the room spinning in a sickening, kaleidoscopic whirl. Her throat felt as though it had been lined with broken glass. Deborah, I can't. I'm really sick, she whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. The door swung open. Deborah stood there, clad in a crisp silk blouse that shimmered under the dim overhead light, her eyes narrow and cold. We all get tired, Lorena. But in this house, we don't indulge in illnesses to avoid our responsibilities. Ronald is out there working his fingers to the bone, and the least you can do is ensure his home is functioning. I've done everything, Lorena gasped, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. The laundry is overflowing, Deborah snapped, pointing a manicured finger toward the hallway. And the washing machine in the basement is broken again. I'm not spending money on a laundromat when we have a perfectly capable, if lazy, woman right here. You want me to wash them by hand? It's what women of your class used to do, isn't it? Deborah sneered, her voice dripping with the psychological warfare she practiced like a fine art. Consider it a way to earn your keep. Since you can't bring a dowry or a career to this marriage, you can at least bring clean clothes. The weight of the water. Lorena dragged herself off the bed, her feet hitting the cold floor like leaden weights. Every step to the bathroom felt like a mile. She collapsed onto a small wooden stool in front of the bathtub, her vision blurring as she filled a plastic basin with tepid water. The smell of the harsh, cheap detergent made her stomach churn. She began to scrub. The wet fabric of Ronald's heavy denim jeans felt like boulders in her hands. She rubbed the cloth together, her raw knuckles, already frayed from years of playing the poor girl, stinging as the soap seeped into the cracks of her skin. The steam from the water mingled with her own feverish heat, making her head throb with a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. She was a daughter of an empire, a woman who had once owned a world of silk and ivory, now reduced to a servant in a Brooklyn bathroom, gasping for air as she laundered the clothes of a man who was already looking for her replacement. Why am I still here? She asked herself, a single tear falling into the soapy water. Why am I protecting a man who lets his mother treat me like a stray dog? She thought of the secret gift her father had sent, the deed to the Grand Azure. She could leave. She could call a car, walk into that five-star lobby, and never look back. But the glass doll inside her was stubborn. She still wanted to see if there was a single ember of the Ronald she once loved left in the cold ash of his ambition. The choice of a coward. The bathroom door creaked open. Ronald stood there, still wearing his work tie, his face pale and strained. He looked at Lorena, her hair matted with sweat, her face flushed a deep, sickly red, her hands trembling as she tried to wring out a heavy sweater. "Lorena," he murmured, his voice momentarily softened by a flicker of the man he used to be. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if to take the heavy fabric from her bruised fingers. "Ronald, don't!" Deborah's voice rang out from the hallway, sharp and commanding. She appeared behind him, her hand landing firmly on his shoulder. "If you coddle her now, she'll never learn. She needs to understand that a man in your position, a man who is about to rub shoulders with the elite of Manhattan, cannot be anchored by a woman who folds under the slightest pressure." Ronald froze. He looked at Lorena, then at his mother, the war between guilt and greed raging behind his eyes. "She's burning up, Mom," Ronald said, though his voice was losing its strength. "She's sensitive, Ronald." "There's a difference," Deborah countered, her eyes fixed on her son. "Think about your meeting tonight with the real estate board. Think about Siska. She doesn't fall ill when things get difficult. She rises. You need a woman who is a pillar, not a patient. If Lorena can't handle a simple day of chores, how is she going to handle being the wife of a CEO? Lorena looked up, her eyes glassy with fever, searching Ronald's face for a sign, any sign, that she mattered more than his rising career. Ronald's gaze shifted. He looked at Lorena's reddened hands, then at the cheap, pilled sweater she wore, and finally at the door. The pity in his eyes curdled into a cold, defensive resentment. It was easier to believe she was weak than to admit he was being cruel. "Mom is right, Ken," he said, his voice turning clinical and distant. "I'm under a lot of pressure right now. I can't be worried about whether the laundry is getting done. You need to be stronger. For me. For our future." It was her hidden lifeline. She held the ownership papers to the very hotel where Ronald was planning to celebrate his ascent into high society with another woman. She owned the marble he would walk on. She owned the air he would breathe as he toasted to a future that didn't include her. A sob escaped her throat, not of joy, but of a profound, soul-crushing irony. She had spent 3 years living in a silver cage of her own making, hoping that Ronald would be her protector, only to realize that she had been the one protecting him from the reality of his own mediocrity. The final test, 1 week of grace. Lorena tucked the document back into the envelope, clutching it to her chest like a shield. As she stepped out of the post office and back into the biting Brooklyn wind, a strange, elegant calm settled over her. The peasant girl was gone, In her place was a woman who had just remembered her own name. She thought of Ronald. She thought of his growing silence, the scent of jasmine on his coat, and the way he had turned his back on her while she scrubbed the floors with a fever. He was a man drowning in greed, fueled by Deborah's toxic whispers. But Lorena was not a woman of impulsive vengeance. She was a woman of deep, perhaps even tragic compassion. 1 week, she whispered into the wind. She decided right then she would give Ronald exactly 7 days. She would remain in her thrift store sweaters. She would continue to pack his lunches. She would offer him her heart, bare and unadorned, one last time. If, within this week, he chose her, if he looked at her and saw the woman who had stood by him in the trenches and decided that she was enough, she would reveal the truth. She would save his business, pay his debts, and they would move into the Azure together. But if he continued down the path of betrayal, if he signed the divorce papers or chose the heiress's gold over the waitress's love, then she would let the hammer fall. She wasn't just giving him a week. She was giving him a chance to save his own soul. As she walked back toward the cramped apartment, her raw knuckles stinging in the cold, Lorena felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. She was no longer a victim of his neglect. She was the judge, the jury, and the silent owner of his destiny. The clandestine letter was not just a gift of property, it was a gift of perspective. She realized that her father was right. She was the light. And if Ronald chose to live in the shadows, she would simply take her light and go home. 7 days, Ronald, she thought as she reached their door, hearing Deborah's shrill laughter from inside. 7 days to prove that my love was worth more than a 5-star view. Choose wisely, for you are standing on a glass floor, and I am the one holding the stone. He turned his back on her, following his mother down the hallway. Lorena sat in the silence of the bathroom, the only sound the steady drip, drip, drip of soapy water falling from the basin. The rejection was more chilling than the winter wind. She realized then that Ronald wasn't just being influenced by his mother. He was using her words as a shield for his own cowardice. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a trophy that didn't require maintenance. As the front door clicked shut and the apartment grew quiet, Lorena let the heavy, wet sweater fall back into the basin with a splash. She leaned her head against the cold, tiled wall, the fever raging in her blood. The erosion of self-worth was over. There was nothing left to erode. In the quiet of her illness, a new clarity emerged. She reached into the pocket of her Daster-like sweater and felt the small, hard edge of her secret phone. I gave you my heart, Ronald, she whispered to the empty room, her voice finally cracking. And you used it as a stepping stone. But you forgot one thing. I own the ground you're trying to step on. She closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in preparation. The fever would break, the laundry would dry, and the peasant girl would finally let the crown she had hidden for so long settle onto her brow. The Brooklyn slush was a dirty, salt-crusted gray as Lorena navigated the few blocks to the local post office. Her legs still felt like lead, a lingering remnant of the flu that had ravaged her body and the emotional coldness that had ravaged her soul. She kept her head down, the hood of her thrift store parka pulled low, hiding the face of a woman who was technically the most powerful person in a 3-block radius, though the world saw only a tired girl in a worn-out coat. The post office was a dimly lit cavern of beige plastic and the smell of damp cardboard. She stood in line, her breath hitching every time she coughed, her raw knuckles tucked into her pockets. When it was finally her turn, she handed over the notice of undeliverable mail she had found taped to their door, a notice Ronald had likely ignored, assuming it was another bill he couldn't pay. Sign here, the clerk muttered, sliding a heavy, oversized envelope across the counter. The moment Lorena's fingers touched the paper, the world around her seemed to tilt. The envelope wasn't made of standard office stock. It was heavy, cream-colored vellum, embossed with a discreet gold seal she hadn't seen in 3 years. The scent hit her immediately, a faint, lingering ghost of expensive tobacco and cedarwood. Her father's scent, a flashback to the gilded warmth. As she walked to a secluded corner of the post office, leaning against a row of dented metal mailboxes, her mind fractured, pulling her back into a memory she had tried to bury. She was 10 years old, sitting in her father's library in their Fifth Avenue estate. The room was a cathedral of knowledge, lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves and bathed in the amber glow of a crackling fireplace. Outside, the New York winter was howling, but inside, the air was warm and smelled of old leather and cinnamon tea. Her father, a man whose name was whispered in boardroom halls with a mixture of terror and awe, didn't look like a titan then. He was just a father, his silver hair catching the light as he knelt beside her chair. "Lorena," he had said, his voice a deep, comforting rumble. "People will tell you that buildings are made of steel and glass. They are wrong. A legacy is built on the strength of the heart that owns it. If you ever find yourself in the dark, remember that you are the light that turns a house into a home and a business into a kingdom. Never let someone make you feel small when you are the one holding the keys." He had handed her a small, ornate silver key that day, a symbol of the trust fund she would one day inherit. He had hugged her, and for a moment, the world felt safe, unshakable, and filled with a love that asked for nothing but her happiness. The lifeline in the dark. The memory faded, replaced by the flickering fluorescent lights and the sound of a distant police siren. Lorena looked down at the envelope. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. Inside was a single, thick document and a handwritten note. "My dearest Lorena, your 25th birthday is upon us. I have watched your experiment from afar with a heavy heart. You sought to find a man who would love the girl and not the gold. But a queen remains a queen even in rags, and a coward remains a coward even in a suit. This is yours. It was always meant for you. The Grand Azure is now legally, solely, under the name Lorena Vanderbilt. Come home, my child. The crown is heavy, but the floor is far too cold for you to keep scrubbing." She pulled out the deed. The legal jargon was a blur, but the bolded letters at the top screamed at her. Certificate of ownership, the Grand Azure Hotel, Manhattan. The rain against the Brooklyn apartment's single, cracked window was no longer a gentle patter. It had become a relentless, rhythmic drumming, as if the city itself were trying to break through the glass and wash away the charade Lorena was living. It was the third day of her final week of grace. She stood at the granite laminate counter, a surface she had scrubbed so many times the faux stone pattern was beginning to fade into a dull, honest gray, preparing a simple vegetable stew. The steam rose in pale, ghostly plumes, dampening the loose strands of hair that had escaped her ponytail. She was still wearing the pilled, gray wool sweater, the itchy fabric a constant reminder of the peasant skin she had adopted. Underneath that sweater, tucked against her ribs like a second heart, was the deed to the Grand Azure. The sound of the front door opening didn't come with the usual fumbling of Ronald's keys. It was a sharp, authoritative click, followed by the unmistakable clack of designer heels on the linoleum. Lorena didn't turn around immediately. She closed her eyes, recognizing the scent before she heard the voices. It was jasmine, the same expensive, suffocating jasmine she had smelled on Ronald's coat. But this time, it was fresh, vibrant, and accompanied by the rustle of high-end silk. "Oh, Ronald, you weren't exaggerating." A voice cooed, dripping with a sugary, artificial sweetness that made Lorena's skin crawl. "It's quaint, very industrial chic, I suppose." Lorena turned slowly, the wooden spoon still in her hand. Deborah stood in the center of the cramped living room, her face lit with a triumphant, cruel glow. Beside her stood a woman who looked like she had been plucked directly from the pages of a high-fashion editorial. Siska was draped in an emerald silk trench coat, her hair a polished mahogany wave that didn't have a single strand out of place. She looked at the apartment with a mixture of pity and amusement, her gaze resting on Lorena with the same detached curiosity one might afford a strange insect found under a rock. "Lorena, dear, stop hovering over that pot and be a good hostess," Deborah snapped, though her eyes were fixed on Siska. "This is Siska. You remember me mentioning the real estate heiress? Her father is currently considering a massive investment in Ronald's company. Unlike some people, Siska actually understands the language of Manhattan." Lorena felt the air in the room grow thin. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just Ronald's infidelity. It was the fact that Deborah had brought the replacement into the sanctuary Lorena had built with her own sweat and tears while she was still standing in it. The door opened again, and Ronald walked in. He looked exhausted, his tie undone, But when his eyes met Siska's, he stood a little straighter, his chest puffing out in a pathetic display of borrowed importance. He didn't look at Lorena. He walked past her as if she were a shadow, heading straight for the small, wobbly dining table where a thick manila envelope already sat waiting. "Is it done?" Deborah asked, her voice a sharp, eager rasp. Ronald finally looked at Lorena, but there was no warmth left in his eyes. Only a cold, clinical logic that he had clearly rehearsed under his mother's tutelage. He tapped the envelope. "Lorena, we need to talk. And I think it's best if we do this now, while everyone is here to witness the necessity of it." "The necessity?" Lorena asked, her voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to the frantic hammering of her heart. Ronald took a deep breath, leaning against the counter. "Look, Ken, I've spent a lot of time thinking. About the business, about my future, and about who I am becoming. Ambition is a hungry god, Lorena. It requires a certain kind of fuel. For 3 years, you've been a comfort. But as I move into these new circles, as I prepare to take my seat at the table with people like Siska's family, I realize that you are a dead weight to my future." The words dead weight felt like a physical blow to Lorena's chest. She looked at his face, searching for a trace of the man who had once promised to love her in sickness and in health. All she saw was a stranger wearing Ronald's skin, a man who had been consumed by the very greed she had tried to protect him from. "A dead weight," she whispered. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Ronald continued, his voice taking on a condescending, businesslike tone. "It's simple math, really. You're a girl from a town that time forgot. You're content with scrubbing floors and counting pennies. You don't have the vision, the elegance, or the class required to stand beside a CEO. Siska can open doors that you don't even know exist. She is an asset. You are a liability. If I stay with you, I'm choosing a small life. And I was born for a big one." Deborah nodded fervently from the sidelines. "Exactly, Ronald. A man is defined by his partner. Why stay with a pebble when you've been offered a diamond?" Siska didn't speak. She simply adjusted her emerald coat and offered Lorena a small, pitying smile that was more insulting than a slap. To Siska, Lorena wasn't even an enemy. She was an obstacle that had already been cleared. Ronald pushed the manila envelope toward Lorena. "These are the divorce papers. I've already signed them. I'm leaving you the furniture and what's left in the joint account. It's more than fair, considering you brought nothing into this marriage but a suitcase and a set of waitressing skills." Lorena looked at the envelope. This was the end of her week of grace. The 7 days weren't even up, and he had already made his choice. He had seen her raw knuckles, her fever, and her quiet sacrifice, and he had decided they were worth less than a seat at the table. A strange, terrifying calm began to spread through Lorena's veins, a cold, crystalline clarity that she had inherited from a father who had built empires out of nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply walked to the table and sat down. "Sign it, Lorena," Deborah urged, leaning over the table. "Don't be difficult. Let him go so he can finally become the man he was meant to be." Lorena picked up the cheap, plastic pen that sat by the napkin holder. Her hand was steady, so steady it seemed to unsettle Ronald. He stepped back a fraction, his brow furrowed as he watched her. He had expected hysterics, pleas, or at least a trembling lip. He hadn't expected the absolute, regal stillness that now radiated from the woman he thought he knew. Lorena flipped to the last page. She saw Ronald's signature, a jagged, arrogant scrawl. She placed the pen to the paper. In that moment, she wasn't just signing a divorce decree, she was signing the death warrant of his future. She was officially releasing him into the world of gold he so desperately craved, knowing that the very gold he was chasing was hers to give or withhold. With a terrifyingly calm hand, she signed her name. Lorena. She closed the folder and stood up, sliding it back toward Ronald. The sound of the folder hitting the granite laminate was the only sound in the room. "It's done," Lorena said, her voice a cool, vibrating chord of finality. "Good," Ronald muttered, though he looked anything but relieved. The calm in her eyes was haunting him, though he couldn't yet understand why. "I'll have the rest of my things picked up by the end of the week. You should probably start looking for a place back home. New York isn't for everyone, Ken." "You're right, Ronald," Lorena said, her gaze moving from him to Deborah and finally to Siska. "New York is a city that eventually reveals exactly who everyone is. I hope you enjoy the view from the top. It can get very cold." She walked toward the bedroom to pack her single suitcase, leaving them standing in her kitchen. As she passed the stew on the stove, she turned off the burner. The steam stopped rising. The warmth left the room. Behind her, she heard Deborah's triumphant laugh and Siska's hushed, bored commentary about the wallpaper. Lorena didn't care. As she folded her thrift store sweaters into her bag, she felt the deed to the Grand Azure pressed against her palm. Ronald had called her a dead weight and a liability. He had chosen the heiress's silk over the wife's soul. He had no idea that he had just signed away his life's dream on a kitchen table he thought was too cheap to matter. The door to the Brooklyn apartment clicked shut with a hollow, metallic finality that echoed through the narrow hallway like the closing of a tomb. Lorena stood in the dim, flickering light of the corridor for a heartbeat longer than necessary, her hand still hovering near the doorknob. Inside, she could still hear the muffled, victorious trill of Deborah's laughter and the low, murmuring baritone of Ronald's voice, a voice that had once whispered promises of eternity but had just delivered a verdict of dead weight. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in that space but the ghost of a woman who had tried to love a man into greatness, only to realize he was far more comfortable in the shadows of his own greed. She gripped the handle of her single, battered suitcase, the same one she had brought 3 years ago, and began the long walk down the 4 flights of stairs. Each step felt like a shedding of skin. The pilled, gray wool sweater she wore felt heavier now, soaked not with water, but with the memory of every insult she had swallowed and every floor she had scrubbed in a desperate, futile attempt to find a love that didn't have a price tag. When she pushed open the heavy steel door to the street, the New York thunderstorm hit her with the force of a physical assault. The sky over Brooklyn was a bruised, electric purple, torn apart by jagged streaks of lightning that illuminated the rain-slicked pavement. The downpour was relentless, a cold, driving sheet of water that turned the city into a blurred watercolor of neon and shadow. Lorena stepped onto the sidewalk, her thin thrift store parka instantly saturated. She didn't open an umbrella. She didn't have one. She let the rain wash over her, cold and biting, welcoming the sharp sting against her skin as a distraction from the suffocating ache in her chest. She began to walk. She didn't head for the subway. She didn't want to be underground. She wanted to see the city. She wanted to feel the scale of the world she had tried to shrink herself to fit into. She walked toward the Manhattan Bridge, her boots splashing through deep, oil-slicked puddles. The city around her was a cacophony of sirens, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, and the distant, rolling thunder that seemed to growl from the very bowels of the skyscrapers. The Bridge of Realization. By the time she reached the pedestrian walkway of the bridge, Lorena was drenched to the bone. The wind whipped her wet hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she kept moving until she reached the midpoint of the span. She stopped there, leaning her suitcase against the vibrating metal railing. To her left, the lights of the financial district glittered through the rain like a field of fallen stars, cold, distant, and unyielding. To her right, the dark expanse of the East River churned, its surface a chaotic mess of white caps and swirling shadows. She lifted her left hand, holding it up against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. The cheap, silver wedding band Ronald had given her 3 years ago sat there, a dull, tarnished circle against her pale, rain-chilled skin. It was a ring that cost less than a week's groceries, a ring she had protected as if it were a holy relic. She stared at it, her internal monologue a jagged roar that rivaled the storm. For 3 years, she had looked at this ring and seen a man named Ronald, a man who was kind, struggling, and possessed of a hidden nobility. She had loved that man. She had sacrificed her comfort, her health, and her identity for that man. But as the rain poured over her, Lorena finally allowed the truth to crystallize in the freezing air. That man never existed. The Ronald she loved was a ghost, a projection of her own desperate hope. She had taken a man with a hollow center and filled him with her own light, convincing herself that the glow she saw was his. But tonight, in that cramped kitchen, the light had been extinguished. He hadn't been changed by Deborah or seduced by Siska. They had simply provided the environment for his true nature to thrive. He was a man who saw love as a liability and status as a god. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a stepping stone. She had been in love with a ghost for 3 years, and the weight of that realization was heavier than the bridge beneath her feet. The weight of a ring. Lorena felt a strange, cold laughter bubble up in her throat, lost to the wind. She thought of the $14,000 brooch in Ronald's pocket and the divorce papers on the granite counter. She thought of how he had called her a peasant, while standing in a city where her father's name was etched into the very foundations of the buildings he so desperately wanted to enter. "You wanted a big life, Ronald," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. "You wanted a seat at the table. But you never realized I am the table." She reached out and gripped the silver band. It felt like a leaden shackle. For 3 years, it had been a symbol of her commitment to a lie. Now, it was just a piece of cheap metal poisoning her finger. She pulled it off. The skin underneath was pale and indented, a permanent mark of the time she had spent trying to be less than she was. She held the ring over the edge of the railing. For a moment, she felt a pang of nostalgia, not for Ronald, but for the girl she used to be, the one who believed that love was the only thing that mattered. That girl was gone now. She had been scrubbed away on linoleum floors and drowned in cold coffee and jasmine perfume. Lorena opened her hand. The silver ring fell, a tiny, insignificant spark lost in the darkness. It didn't make a sound as it hit the churning water of the East River. It was gone, carried away by the current, destined to be buried in the silt of the harbor along with the rest of New York's discarded secrets. As the ring vanished, Lorena felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The glass doll her father always spoke of, the fragile, hopeful part of her that sought a pure, unadorned love, wasn't just cracked. It was shattered, and in its place was something much harder. Something made of the same steel and glass as the city surrounding her. The call home. She reached into the inner pocket of her parka, pulling out the waterproof casing that held her secret phone. Her fingers were numb, but her heart was steady. She dialed a number she hadn't called in over 1,000 days. The line didn't even ring twice before it was picked up. "Lorena!" Her father's voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, powerful, and filled with a warmth that the New York storm could never touch. It was the voice of the only man who had ever truly seen her worth without needing a price tag attached to it. Lorena closed her eyes, letting a single, hot tear escape and mix with the freezing rain. "The glass doll is broken, Dad," she said, her voice vibrating with a new, terrifyingly elegant strength. "The experiment is over. I tried to find a heart, but all I found was a price tag." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. "I'm sorry, my child," her father whispered, his voice thick with a father's grief and a titan's fury. "I told you that the world is a hungry place." "I know now," Lorena replied, looking out at the glittering lights of the Grand Azure in the distance, the 5-star hotel she now legally owned. "I'm done being small, Dad. I'm done scrubbing floors for people who can't see the stars. Bring me home." "A car is already on its way to the bridge, Lorena." "I never stopped watching over you," her father said. "Where do you want to go?" "The estate." Lorena looked at the Manhattan skyline, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the tower where Ronald hoped to build his empire. A cold, beautiful smile touched her lips, the kind of smile that had once made her father's competitors tremble. "No," she said, her voice as sharp as a diamond. "Take me to the Grand Azure. I want to see my birthday gift. And Dad, tell Pac Brodo to start the preparations. We have an engagement party to host in a few days, and I want to make sure the guest of honor gets exactly what he paid for." She hung up the phone and stood tall on the bridge, the wind whipping her saturated clothes. She was no longer the waitress from a small town. She was no longer the dead-weight wife. She was Lorena Vanderbilt, and she was coming home to claim her kingdom. The Manhattan rain continued to fall, but for the first time in 3 years, Lorena didn't feel the cold. She felt the fire. The black obsidian sedan glided through the wrought iron gates of the Vanderbilt estate with a ghost-like silence, its tires barely whispering against the meticulously raked gravel. Inside, cocooned in the scent of hand-stitched leather and the muted hum of climate control, Lorena watched the rain-streaked world of Brooklyn recede into a blurred, distant memory. She was still wearing the saturated gray wool sweater, the peasant shell that had become her skin for 3 years, but as the car wound through the miles of manicured gardens and ancient oaks that shielded her true home from the prying eyes of the world, the fabric began to feel like a foreign object, a coarse reminder of a life she had finally outgrown. When the car came to a halt beneath the grand portico of the main house, the heavy doors of the mansion swung open, casting a warm, amber glow onto the wet pavement. A phalanx of staff stood in perfect, silent formation, their heads bowed in a synchronization of respect that felt like a sharp, physical blow to her chest. For 3 years, Lorena had been the invisible girl, the one people walked past in the subway, the one Ronald's mother had spat upon with the word peasant. Now, as she stepped out of the car, the lead butler, a man she had known since childhood, stepped forward with an umbrella held at a precise angle. "Welcome home, Miss Lorena," he whispered, his voice thick with a genuine, understated emotion. "The master has been waiting for you." Lorena walked into the grand foyer, her wet boots leaving muddy prints on the white Carrara marble. In Brooklyn, a muddy floor was a crisis, a reason for Deborah to scream about filth. Here, a team of silent cleaners would erase the marks before she even reached the top of the stairs, not because she was a tyrant, but because she was a queen returning to her sanctuary. The air in the estate didn't smell like ammonia or cheap store-brand coffee. It smelled of beeswax, ancient mahogany, and the faint, haunting fragrance of fresh, white lilies, her favorite flower, which her father ensured was in every room she might enter. Her father was standing by the fireplace in the great hall, a silhouette of immense power and quiet grief. When he saw her, drenched, shivering, and wrapped in the rags of her own making, the titan of industry didn't speak. He simply opened his arms. Lorena collapsed into them, the pilled gray wool finally coming into contact with the finest cashmere. She wept then, not for the husband she had lost, but for the girl who had tried so hard to prove that the world was kinder than it actually was. "I'm sorry, Dad," she sobbed into his chest. "I wanted to believe." "Believing is never a sin, Lorena," he murmured, his hand stroking her matted hair. "But staying when the truth is revealed is a tragedy. Go. Wash away the dust of that life. Your kingdom is waiting." The transformation was visceral, a slow, methodical peeling away of the woman Ronald had called dead weight. Lorena stood in the center of her marble bathroom, watching as a maid, with hands far softer than her own had become, carefully cut away the gray wool sweater with silver shears. It fell to the floor in wet, pathetic heaps. Lorena stepped into a bathtub carved from a single block of rose quartz, the water infused with essential oils that cost more than Ronald's monthly rent. As the heat seeped into her bones, she looked at her hands. The raw, red knuckles and the cracks from the Brooklyn winter seemed to fade under the application of rare, healing balms. The waitress was being erased, layer by layer. Her hair, once dull and tangled from neglect, was washed and treated until it regained its mahogany sheen. A crown of silk that framed a face that was no longer pale with fever, but sharp with a newfound obsidian steel. When she finally emerged, she was draped in a robe of heavy, midnight blue silk. She looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the small-town girl Ronald had patronized. She was a Vanderbilt. Her eyes, once filled with a desperate, pleading hope, were now cool, calculating, and possessed of a frighteningly elegant clarity. She realized then that she hadn't just reclaimed her name, she had forged a weapon out of her own heartbreak. By the next morning, Lorena was no longer in the estate. She had moved into the penthouse suite of the Grand Azure, the 5-star jewel of Manhattan that she now legally owned. But she remained in the shadows. She didn't announce her arrival to the staff or the press. Instead, she took her seat in the darkened security and management hub on the top floor, a room of glass and glowing monitors that overlooked the entire city. She began to manage the hotel with a lens of newfound steel. She went through every department, every vendor, every line item of the upcoming events. Her presence was felt as a series of anonymous executive directives that sharpened the hotel's already impeccable standards into something razor-edged. She was a phantom in the machine, a silent owner who knew the value of every dollar because she had spent 3 years counting pennies. Pac Brodo, her father's most trusted operative and now her right hand, stood beside her as she reviewed the digital file for the Pratama Wijaya engagement gala. "They have requested a discount on the floral arrangements, Miss Lorena," Pac Brodo noted, his eyes scanning the screen. "And it appears the groom's mother, a Mrs. Deborah, has been quite vocal with the catering staff about wanting extra appetizers at no cost, citing their high-standing connection to the Wijaya family." Lorena leaned back in her leather chair, the midnight silk of her suit shimmering under the dim lights of the hub. A cold, beautiful smile touched her lips, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, the kind of smile she had learned from a father who never lost a war. "Give them everything, Pac Brodo," Lorena said, her voice a low, vibrating chord of authority. "Give them the most expensive lilies. Upgrade their menu to the platinum tier. Provide the vintage champagne that costs $1,000 a bottle. Do not charge them a cent more for the upgrades. In fact, mark it all as a VIP complimentary gift from the owner." Pac Brodo paused, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Miss, you want to reward them?" "No," Lorena replied, her gaze fixing on the image of Ronald and Cisco on the screen, a photo taken at a recent charity event. Ronald looked smug, his chest puffed out, unaware that the very ground he was standing on was owned by the woman he had discarded as a liability. "I want them to feel like they are standing on the very peak of the world. I want them to feel so secure, so arrogant, and so high-class that they don't even notice the glass floor beginning to crack. I want their joy to be so immense that when the truth hits, the vacuum it leaves behind will be enough to crush them." She turned her chair toward the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The rain had stopped, and the city was a glittering grid of gold and light. Somewhere down there, in a rented apartment or a temporary suite, Ronald was likely celebrating his ascent, believing he had finally found a woman who matched his ambition. He had no idea that the peasant girl was currently orchestrating every second of his supposed triumph. The first light of dawn over Manhattan was not a sudden burst, but a slow, ethereal unfurling of violet, gold, and rose-gold hues that began to dissolve the sharp, jagged edges of the skyline. On the private balcony of the penthouse suite at the Grand Azure, Lorena stood alone, her silhouette framed against the vast expanse of Central Park. The park below looked like a sea of sleeping velvet, the shadows of the ancient trees retreating as the sun began its ascent over the Atlantic. She was no longer wearing the heavy midnight silk of the night before, nor was she draped in the itchy, gray wool of her 3-year exile. Instead, she wore a simple, impeccably tailored white linen suit, the color of a clean slate, of a new beginning. The air at this height was thin, crisp, and carried the faint, bracing scent of the morning tide, a stark contrast to the stagnant, ammonia-filled air of the Brooklyn apartment she had once called home. Lorena leaned against the cool stone railing, her hands resting lightly on the surface. She looked at them, truly looked at them. The raw, angry redness was gone, replaced by a soft, healthy glow, but the memory of the cracks and the soreness remained etched in her mind like a secret map. She realized then that those marks weren't symbols of her peasant status, as Deborah had so cruelly suggested, but badges of honor. They were proof that she was a woman who could survive the trenches of a small life and emerge with her soul intact. The true measurement of wealth. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm, amber glow across her face, Lorena felt a profound, echoing sense of self-actualization. 4 years, she had lived in the shadows of 2 powerful forces, her father's overwhelming legacy and Ronald's suffocating greed. She had spent 3 years trying to find a version of herself that was enough without her bank account, only to realize that the bank account was never the source of her value. Her worth was never in the 5-star view she now owned, nor was it in the billion-dollar toy her father had gifted her for her birthday. It wasn't even in the marriage she had tried so desperately to save. "My wealth," she whispered to the waking city, her voice a low, vibrating chord of newfound peace, "is the fact that I walked out of that apartment with nothing but my name and my dignity, and I didn't break. I am the steel in the foundations of this building, not just the name on the deed." She realized that the glass doll her father had always warned her about had indeed shattered on the Manhattan Bridge, but it hadn't left her empty. Instead, it had revealed a core made of something far more precious than glass or gold: resilience. She had been tested by fire, by betrayal, and by the cold indifference of a man who saw her as a liability, and she had discovered that she was the most valuable asset in the room. Breaking the final shadow, Lorena closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun soak into her skin. She thought of Ronald and Deborah one last time. In her mind, they were no longer villains. They were merely ghosts, faded, pathetic figures retreating into the shadows of the night. She had paid their debts, not out of a lingering love for Ronald, but as an act of final, absolute severance. She had bought her own freedom from their narrative. She thought of the dead weight, insult Ronald had hurled at her on that granite counter. In the clarity of the morning, she understood the irony. She had been the only thing keeping his world afloat. The moment she let go, his house of cards had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. He had wanted a big life, but he had failed to realize that a big life requires a big heart, and his was hollow. Lorena felt a sudden, weightless sensation in her chest. The anger was gone. The resentment was gone. Even the grief had been washed away by the Manhattan rain. What was left was a terrifyingly elegant clarity. She was Lorena Vanderbilt, but she was also the girl who knew how to count pennies and scrub floors. She was the fusion of the elite and the enduring, a leader who understood the value of every soul because she had lived amongst those who were treated as nothing. The first day of a sovereign. The sound of the balcony door sliding open broke her reverie. Pac Brodo stood there, his face illuminated by the morning sun, holding a digital tablet and a cup of real, artisan coffee. Not the bitter, metallic roast of her Brooklyn mornings. "The board members are arriving in the conference room, Miss Lorena," Pac Brodo said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound respect. "They are eager to meet the woman who has been orchestrating the hotel's transformation from the shadows." Lorena took a final look at Central Park. The shadows were completely gone now, replaced by a vibrant, living green. The city was alive, a grid of endless possibilities. She turned away from the railing, her white linen suit catching the light, and walked toward the door. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes, Pac Brodo," she said, her voice steady and clear, the voice of an independent leader who no longer needed a man to define her league. "And ensure the staff knows that from today, we are no longer just a hotel of luxury. We are a hotel of integrity. Every guest, from the billionaire to the person seeking shelter, is to be treated with the same respect. We are done with service entrances for the soul." Pac Brodo bowed deeply. "Yes, Miss Lorena. New York is ready for you." As she walked through the penthouse and toward the elevator, Lorena caught her reflection in a hall mirror. She didn't see a peasant, nor did she see a waitress, or a liability. She saw a woman who had survived the storm and learned to command the wind. She saw a sovereign who had found her own crown in the ruins of a betrayal. The elevator doors opened, and as she stepped inside to descend toward her first official board meeting, Lorena felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any ocean. She had spent 3 years in exile, but the Fajar, the dawn, had finally arrived. She was no longer living in the shadows of Ronald's ambition or her father's expectations. She was Lorena, and the horizon was hers to command. The story of the silver cage was over. The story of the resilient queen was just beginning.